Here we have two wires, and by the end of this video you're going to know my favorite way to do a soldered wire splice and another way, just because. So to get started, we're going to strip about 1/2 inch of the wire on both sides. I am going to use an automatic wire stripper tool. Okay, so we have both wires stripped. I like to twist the wires. The direction isn't incredibly important. And then before you go any farther, you want to add your heat shrink tubing, because all soldered splices should have heat shrink tubing, and you don't want it to be too close to your joint. If it's too close to your joint, the heat will creep down the wire and then shrink the heat shrink. So now that we have the heat shrink on our wires, we'll cross the two wires at about the middle of the stripped area. And then it's difficult to see, but we'll fold the wires over each other so that they begin to wrap around each other. And then we'll do that multiple times. And this wire looks as if it's pre-tinned by the strand. But you don't want to pre-tin your wires manually if you do this. You want to leave them as they are when you strip them. Otherwise, they would be impossible to do this with. So then all you're going to do is put your iron on the wires and add your solder. You want to add the solder to the iron and the wire at the same time until you've got enough that the heat flows through the wire. The reason for that is before you have added any solder, there's not a large contact area for the heat to flow through, so the heat doesn't flow very well. But once you've added solder, you don't want to keep adding directly to the iron, because you want to make sure you have the feedback of the wire being hot enough, and you know it's hot enough whenever you can add the solder directly to the wire, not to the iron. If we look at this joint, we can see how the solder has soaked into the wire. And it doesn't look like a big clump of solder. That would be too much. Too much is better than not enough, but you still are not aiming for too much. It would be a lot more apparent if this wire was copper colored from the start, but it wasn't. And you always want to double check your work, because when I looked closer with my own eyes, I could see that the solder didn't soak all the way through to one side. So I'm just going to add a little more. I'm using 60/40 tin lead solder. I only recommend leaded solder. So here now you can see that there's a little more solder than just enough to soak into the wires. That way you know that you've got plenty of solder in your joint, but it's not quite excessive. So now if that joint is cool to the touch, you don't have to wait till it's cool to the touch for this part, but it helps. We'll slide our heat shrink tubing over it. And then we'll finish off with some hot air. I'm soldering at a temperature of 730 degrees Fahrenheit, and my hot air station is set to, it's currently still climbing. I have been reflow soldering with it. It's actually set a lot higher than it needs to be for heat shrink. It's 770. I only really recommend 500 or so degrees, and then you can convert to figure out what that is in Celsius. So for that, you could use a heat gun, a blow dryer, even a lighter, which I'll do for the next one. So this next one, these wires are already stripped back a little bit. They were like this in my drawer of salvaged wire, so they were just already this way. So I'm going to use a little bit of a different methodology. Since this splice is just going to be a lap splice, the wires will be lapped over top of each other. I will go ahead and tin these wires before I start. With this kind of joint, you can tin them first or you cannot. It doesn't matter. This joint is more difficult to make unless you have a helping hands tool like I have. And so now that both wires are tinned, you'll get them positioned where they're touching each other. And I'm just now demonstrating what you don't want to do is forget your heat shrink tubing. You want to put that on before you make the joint. It's a very common mistake among beginners and professionals alike to forget the heat shrink tubing and have to cut it off and make a new splice. So don't ever feel bad when you make that mistake. It happens, but I know it's frustrating. So now we'll examine that splice. And again, on the bottom side of the splice, it didn't soak all the way into the wire. That's one of the difficulties with soldering, particularly heavier gauge wire, is it sucks away the heat of the iron so quickly. But also trying to do it for a camera, I'm having a hard time seeing what I'm doing. But when you are soldering on something that soaks up so much heat, such as a wire like this, you'll just have to increase the amount of time you spend with the iron. Because as it takes longer to heat up, you're not going to overheat anything by spending more time because it's not getting up to temperature for a longer period of time. And then as it cools, you don't want to blow. It'll cool down too quickly and it could make for a weak joint. So now we'll examine this joint again. You can see there's evidence where I have worked it a little bit longer than the life of the flux. It's not a perfect looking joint. That's one reason I'm not a fan of this type of splice, is because it's more difficult to do. But as I look closer with my own eyes, it is definitely a good joint. So now that it's cool to the touch, not necessarily cool, but it's not too hot to touch, we will go ahead, slide the heat shrink tubing over it, and we'll shrink this one with an open flame. That went so much quicker than with the hot air. And even though it gets so hot, the other side of it could still be shrunk a little bit more most of the time. So I'll flip it over in my helping hands here, and I'll give it one more go. And that's it. Now you know how to make a quality soldered wire splice. If this has been helpful, go ahead and hit that like button. Consider subscribing if you'd like some more soldering tips, soldering advice, soldering tutorials, anything soldering related, sometimes electronics, and leave a comment. It really helps the channel out. And I'll see you guys in the next one.